Hello, good evening and welcome everybody. Delighted to see so many of you here in the Rothenberg Hall for the fourth in our series of centennial lectures to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the founding of the Huntington. My name is Steve Hindle, I'm Director of Research here at the Huntington, where I run the fellowship program, the conference program and the lecture program, and I'm delighted to be your host for this evening. The Centennial Lecture Program was designed to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the signing of the Deed of Indenture by Henry and Arabella Huntington, which turned their extraordinary private art, library and botanical collections into a public research institute for the benefit of scholars and the wider public in the state of California. And to that end, the Centennial Lecture Program was really designed to bring back to the Huntington leading scholars in their respective fields who'd worked on the treasures of Henry and Arabella's collections, and to ask those scholars to revisit those items for an early 21st century audience, speaking specifically to the provenance of the item in question, how did it come to be at the Huntington Library, but especially also to its relevance for an early 21st century audience. This lecture is made possible by an endowment created in honor of Alan Nevins. It's the Alan Nevins Lecture in American History, created in honor of a senior scholar in American history who was senior research associate at the Huntington for much of his career. The lecture series was created for the specific purpose of inviting speakers to give public lectures in early American history. And past lecturers have included Mary Sarah Bilder, Joanne Freeman, Holger Hook, Andrew O'Shaughnessy, and Christopher Brown. Really delighted to introduce to you this evening Joyce Chaplin, who is our Centennial Nevins lecturer. She's the James Duncan Phillips Professor of Early American History in the Department of History at Harvard University, where she's taught since 2000. She holds her first degree from Northwestern and her MA and PhD from Johns Hopkins. She's held fellowships from the Fulbright Commission, the John Carter Brown Library, the Massachusetts Historical Society, the Neubauer Collegium at the University of Chicago, and, of course, here at the Huntington. She's held visiting professorships at the University of Leeds, regrettably on the wrong side of the Pennines, and at the University of Sydney, regrettably on the wrong coast of Australia. She taught at Vanderbilt University before moving to Harvard. She's the author of a number of hugely influential books in early American history, ranging across environmental history, economic history, and the history of science and technology. First, An Anxious Pursuit, Agricultural Innovation and Modernity in the Lower South, 1730 to 1815, which won the Willie Lee Rose Book Prize of the Southern Association of Women Historians. Subject Matter, Technology, the Body and Science on the Anglo-American Frontier, which appeared in 2001. The First Scientific American, Benjamin Franklin and the Pursuit of Genius, published in 2006, which won the Annabelle Jenkins Prize of the American Society for 18th Century Studies and was a finalist for the Los Angeles Times Book Prize. In 2009, she published Benjamin Franklin's Political Arithmetic, A Materialist View of Humanity. And in 2012, Round About the Earth, Circumnavigation from Magellan to Orbit. With Alison Bashford in 2016, she published The New Worlds of Thomas Robert Malthus, Rereading the Principle of Population. She's also edited numerous volumes and texts, including Genealogies of Genius in 2015, which grew out of a conference that she convened here at the Huntington a couple of years before that. All of this suggests that her interests and recognition in early American history are absolutely outstanding, and I can think of no fitter scholar to come back to the Huntington and address a topic that's been so close to her career and interest for such a long time. She is the editor of the Norton Critical Edition of Benjamin Franklin's autobiography, the text of which, as you will hear, we hold here at the Huntington. So to discuss Benjamin Franklin, the often truthful, always radical, never completed American founder, please welcome the Huntington's Centennial Nevins lecturer, Professor Joyce Chaplin.
Thank you so much, Steve. I feel that I owe so much to the Huntington, and it's just a wonderful pleasure to be back here again. Thank you all for coming, and I hope you can all hear me. Excellent, then I can begin. This evening I am going to talk about the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin, so obviously I'm telling a rags to riches story, right? I must, by definition, trace a narrative in which the hero, originally poor and overlooked, works and strives and ends up being valuable and valued beyond anyone's initial expectations, maybe even the hero's. And I will indeed tell that tale, only I'll mostly tell it about the manuscript of Franklin's autobiography, and only secondarily about Franklin himself. But that's because the manuscript, the thing, represents the person, Benjamin Franklin, uncannily in three ways: in its often but not always fully truthful disclosures, in its radical existence as a story of a nobody who became a somebody and why that happened, and in its incomplete state, implying a never-ending story that we can always keep telling. One way to think about all of these things together is to consider the rags to riches nature of the physical object that holds the story, the unique manuscript of Benjamin Franklin's autobiography held here at the Huntington Library. Once upon a time in the global West, paper was made from rags. In pre-modern Europe, if clothing wasn't made from wool, it tended to be made from linen, which supplied the shirts and chemises that everyone wore as everyday underwear, plus all household linen, sheets and towels and tablecloths and napkins and the like. When eventually worn into rags that not even the poor could use, many of these linen items were sold to paper makers. These artisans, women, men, and children, sorted the rags, chopped them into small pieces, soaked them in water, and when the sodden mass was good and rotted, they pulped it into a fine sediment that was suspended in liquid. A skilled paper maker could submerge a rectangular frame into the pulp and with an expert jiggling shake, withdraw the frame, which was lined with fine wire mesh to retain a thin layer of the pulp. The water would drain away, and the damp sheet of congealed rag sediment was then placed in a stack, each sheet interspersed with a layer of wool felt to absorb yet more of the water. The sheet would next be hung to dry, and the result was a piece of paper, one that when damp might have been impressed with a watermark, a trademark of the paper maker. A standard sheet of paper, what was called a folio or leaf, ranged from about 290 by 420 millimeters to 280 by 380 millimeters. And I'll just point out that our standard 8.5 by 11-inch sheet of paper is descended from the typical size of a folio sheet folded in half. Folded and cut down to various sizes, this rag paper provided nearly everything used for writing and printing in the 15th through 18th centuries. A few very grand documents were still produced on parchment, thin, polished sheets of animal skin, as had been the case in the Middle Ages. But everything else, from fine white paper for writing and printing to rough brown paper for packaging and industrial uses, was made of this predominantly linen rag paper, ancestor of the rag paper still used to produce US currency, as with this example. So, rags to riches. Franklin would, I've got to say, would have loved being on the $100 bill. As a printer, he knew exactly how such paper was made. He knew what it would have cost in his era, and he knew what could be printed on it to give it greater value. Above all, in his case, information that added value. Printers in his era were distinctive creatures who worked with their heads and their hands. Most of them wrote or edited or simply read and read and read in order to find the right information to put into print, the kind that would sell, the kind that would make their names. That was the head work. But printers always also worked with their hands, which marked them as social inferiors. A gentleman or lady was somebody who never needed to do that. Artisans had enormous pride in their work, but they existed toward the lower end of the social hierarchy, which Franklin, as an artisan, as a printer, was acutely aware of. And this is what he emphasized when he came to write the story of his life. Now, I'm not the first person to use a blank sheet of paper, so evocative in its pure possibility, to signify the as yet unwritten human life that begins with a birth, and thus the birth of the hero of our story, the manuscript of Franklin's autobiography. We don't know the day itself, the manuscript's precise birthday. As was true, actually, for a great many people at the time, we just know the season and the year of the manuscript's birth. It was the summer of 1771. We do, however, know the place of its birth, this lovely house at Twyford in the county of Berkshire, at the home of Jonathan Shipley, Bishop of St. Asulph. So Franklin's mortal life began in Boston, New England, among other American people, but the story of his life began in Old England on sheets of European paper. Shipley was one of Franklin's closest English friends, and Shipley's father had been a London stationer, one of the craftsmen involved in putting printed material onto paper. At a visit to Shipley's home that summer in 1771, Franklin began a project to record his life. Friends had already suggested to him that he write a general moral guide to life, The Art of Virtue, and this was intended as a more formal version of The Way to Wealth, a famous compendium Franklin had made of the wit and wisdom of Richard Saunders, the fictional character who'd fronted his famous Poor Richard almanacs. But instead of doing that art of virtue, Franklin decided to teach virtue through personal example, meaning the exemplary ups and downs of his own life. So, at the age of 65, still in relatively good health, he embarked on writing his memoirs. It took 19 years to write a draft, an incompleted draft, which is almost certainly much longer than Franklin would have thought it would have taken. The problem was that big historical events kept getting in his way. The manuscript, the one that is now held at the Huntington, was generated, therefore, at 4 different times during the last quarter of Franklin's life and composed in 3 different locations as he kept moving around, carrying this with him and trying to add to it. Whenever and wherever he wrote, he used folio-sized pieces of paper, each sheet folded in half to measure about 25 by 38 centimeters, very slightly larger than an 8.5 by 11 sheet. He added folded sheets as he went along, each one of them generating 2 leaves with 2 sides, 4 pages in total. He divided each page lengthwise into 2 columns and composed an initial draft on one side, leaving the opposite column blank, therefore leaving a space where he could jot notes about adding or altering material later, or where he could draft insertions or alterations to what he had already written. And in fact, most of the pages, 200 out of the total of 230, 200 of these pages include alterations of some kind, made as either Franklin was composing the original text or else when he had moved on to later events and was therefore reconsidering how he'd presented earlier parts of the story. The page with the densest alterations is the very first one, the original blank sheet, as Franklin, who was a connoisseur of words, was struggling to craft just the right start to the story, a hook to snag readers, the perfect lead. The first attempt that you see under Dear Son, he was writing the original draft to his son. I'll get into that in a bit. This first attempt began with an overview of the Franklin family's general history. That must have seemed too removed from Franklin's true subject, himself, because he added in the margin, you can see there, several personal comments. His progress from the poverty and obscurity in which I was born and bred to a state of affluence and some degree of reputation. His belief that he should have no objection to a repetition of the same life from its beginning, so long as he could correct its errata or errors. And his cleverly disarming admission that writing his memoirs would gratify his vanity. So there, he'd said it first. He made decisions about how to shape the story as he went along. For example, all but one of his famous errata, the major mistakes of his youth, which he'd claimed to correct, are additions in the extra column of the pages, and that's how we know they were afterthoughts, only later inserted into the narrative flow. These little confessions add greatly to the story, and they show Franklin's conscience at work, revealing that his initial desire had been to show himself in the best light possible, then his realization that it would be better to confess at least some of his failings, his running away from his brother's employment, his dubious relations with a friend's girlfriend, and so on. Given that the manuscript has a 19-year history of composition, it's not surprising that Franklin's reasons for writing it changed considerably. He wrote the first of the 4 sections, 87 manuscript pages, so about 38% of the total. He wrote the first section in the summer of 1771 during that 2-week visit to Bishop Shipley. I think he took his meals with the family and then just kept writing. He addressed this opening piece to his only surviving son, his illegitimate son, William Franklin. But by the time he wrote the next section, he had broken with William, who had remained loyal to Great Britain while his father sided with the American insurgents. At this point, the manuscript crossed the Atlantic when, in 1775, Franklin abandoned Britain and went home. The momentous events of that year and through July 1776 left him quite understandably without time to write. And so the manuscript went back across the Atlantic, this time to France, where Franklin represented U.S. interests to the court of Louis XVI. At the end of the war, in the 1780s, friends urged Franklin to please carry on. Released from his ambassadorial duties by 1784, once the United States had achieved its independence from Great Britain, Franklin resumed writing. At this point, he intended his life story for a wider audience, the rising generation of independent Americans, the substitutes for his son. With them in mind, he managed to write part 2 of his memoirs, only a dozen pages, though these include his delightful list of the 13 virtues he tried to instill in himself. So we see here temperance, later joined by industry, lose no time, chastity, rarely use venery, but for health or offspring, never to dullness. And then 13, humility, imitate Socrates and Jesus. And then the manuscript got packed up again in 1785 and went back across the Atlantic, back to Philadelphia. Their public service distracted Franklin yet again. He was swept back into politics as head of the government of Pennsylvania and as a Pennsylvania representative at the Constitutional Convention in 1787. In 1788, Franklin retired from public office for good and wrote part 3 of his narrative, 119 pages, the longest part, 52% of the total. But his rapidly declining health interrupted his work. It was impossible for him, once he'd made a slight recovery, to compose more than a very short part 4 before his death in 1790. Probably too weak to grasp a pen himself, he most likely dictated these final 7 pages to his grandson until he was silenced by congestion in his chest. The narrative simply ends in the middle of 1758. Franklin had sketched an outline for the book, probably when he began writing the first part of it, so we do have a sense of what he had wanted to include. But this only covers events through his departure for France in 1776. So it's a fact. We can't get around it. The manuscript is incomplete, with no full text for the last 32 years of Franklin's life and no outline for the final 14 years. There's another problem in the fact that the memoirs had a rival. In his autobiography, Franklin described himself as the youngest son of the youngest son for 5 generations back. He would therefore have appreciated that the story of his life was younger sibling and second fiddle to his acknowledged masterwork, his experiments and observations on electricity. So let me just ask people here, how many people have read Franklin's autobiography? How many people have read the experiments and observations on electricity? This would obviously have been, the case would have been reversed during his lifetime, when almost nobody read his autobiography, but his experiments and observations were famous, both as a book that people read and then famous as a book people knew about, even if they hadn't read it. This work was completed in Franklin's lifetime, first printed in 1751, done to his specifications, updated and expanded several times, each time adding to his public reputation as natural philosopher. And I'll just point out, this was an enormous achievement. Too often today, Franklin's work in science is described as if it were amusing and incidental. Hobby-like electrocution of turkeys, gee whiz flying of kites, and other such odd hijinks. Now, in truth, Franklin did his experiments in the late 1740s as investigations into the essential nature of matter. So please remember that this is what Franklin did during his lifetime, investigations in the essential nature of matter itself, happening to use electrical phenomena. When he published descriptions of those experiments, his contemporaries understood them to be some of the most serious science since Isaac Newton in what would later be called physics. At the time, different scientific practitioners had proposed different theories about electricity. It was known to occur, but no one knew why. Some proposed that maybe it only resulted from certain kinds of matter, such as amber, or maybe it was its own form of matter, a modern elemental substance to be placed along with those of classical antiquity, earth, air, fire, and water. Franklin hypothesized instead that electricity was a universal material phenomenon existing throughout nature and taking two material forms, positive and negative. That's why you have to look when you put batteries into whatever you put batteries into. When the positive and negative charges were in equilibrium, the electrical phenomenon was not evident. But when the positive and negative charges were unequal, the disparity generated electrical manifestations that were apparent to the senses, primarily through sight and touch. Franklin's experiments thus laid essential groundwork for all subsequent investigations of electricity, also magnetism and electromagnetism, which likewise manifest in opposing negative and positive charges. Also, Franklin explained, an electrical charge could be concentrated in a battery, a physical object he helped to invent and a term he coined for it, making possible future applications of electricity for practical use. His kite experiment verified that electricity occurred in the atmosphere, an experiment still honored by the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers, which uses a stylized kite as one of its professional icons. And Franklin's promotion of lightning rods to safely discharge lightning strikes on houses and ships was a notable early example of scientific knowledge being used to improve everyday life. I want to stress also that Franklin's work in science exemplified a radical shift in Western culture. He worked at a moment when natural science, empirically based investigation of the material world, was acquiring a central position in public life. Natural knowledge had always existed. Science was not invented for the first time in the 18th century, but confidence that everyone could and should know natural science was new. Science was done by a surprising range of people: working class men, noble women, free African Americans, mariners, nuns, pretty much everybody. Their discoveries were published in formats that people were supposed to be able to understand if they could simply read. Even children were given descriptions of Newtonian physics tailored to their level of comprehension. And even for people who couldn't read, there were dramatic public demonstrations of scientific experiments. Electrical equipment generating flashes and shocks, air pumps demonstrating that absence of air snuffed out candles or killed animals, balloons showing how substances lighter than air could carry humans up into the atmosphere. For the first time, the general public was asked to believe that evidence-based knowledge of the material world was the foundation of civility, humanity, improvement. Franklin's experiments and observations, published in colloquial English and intended for a reading public beyond his fellow experimenters, is a perfect example of this new confidence in science as part of the cultural capital that everyone was supposed to be able to possess. Franklin wrote up his experiments in letters addressed to a scientific patron in London, Peter Collinson, and this added to the sense that he was just explaining things as if to a friend. He published those letters again in 1751 with a London printer. And thus, the older rival to Franklin's memoirs was born. As he had surely hoped, the experiments and observations changed his life. He became famous. So much so that a French theorist of electricity objected that this Franklin of the experiments could not actually exist. So unlikely did it seem that a colonial printer from Philadelphia, wherever that was, would be able to redefine the nature of matter, that the Frenchman assumed a learned European adversary must have done the experiments and then concocted this laughably humble person as a cover for himself. Once it was established that a Mr. Franklin of Philadelphia did actually exist, he became famous, iconic, a celebrity in the very early days when it was first possible for commoners to become celebrated enough to have fan bases, science made Franklin a relative nobody into a somebody. Franklin's fame might have astonished even him. He surely never expected that the German philosopher Immanuel Kant would name him the Prometheus of the modern age, comparing him to the ancient god Prometheus, who had stolen fire from heaven to give mortal humans a source of light, heat, and energy. The modern Franklin was similarly godlike, because he kept humans safe from lightning, fire from heaven, through lightning rods. So here he is, presiding among other deities and immortal figures, the Prometheus of the modern age. He was probably surprised. He was undoubtedly pleased. Franklin did expect that publishing his 1751 experiments and observations would give him status and power that would have been unavailable to a mere colonial artisan who worked with his hands. Later in 1751, for example, he won election to the Pennsylvania Assembly. The next year, he was appointed Deputy Postmaster General of North America. In 1752, he received honorary degrees from Harvard and Yale and was awarded the Copley Medal of the Royal Society of London, Britain's premier scientific organization. Many subsequent honors followed, as well as political positions: colonial agent based in London, American commissioner based in Paris. These perks, it is important to note, would never otherwise have gone to the youngest son of a Boston craftsman who had made soap and candles from animal fat. Nor were they likely honors for a colonial printer, however hardworking and successful. To become the Franklin now familiar to us, statesman and American founder, he had to have lifted himself above the ordinary range of achievement by winning an international reputation in science. That put him on a par with propertied colonists like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, also with prosperous and hyper-educated New Englanders like John Adams. On a par with them, I say, but probably above, because Franklin became much better known throughout the colonies, let alone in Europe, where Washington, Jefferson, and Adams were unknown before 1776. This is why Franklin began to write his memoirs in 1771. Note the date. The American Revolution did not make him famous. He was famous before that. Now, admittedly, his representation in the United States during the War for Independence consolidated his fame. He would be, by 1784, when he resumed writing his memoirs, the most famous and instantly recognizable American of the era. Indeed, one of the most famous people of the age, plastered onto paper, fabric, china, terracotta, metal, in images that included, I'm sad to say, at least one pornographic print, and at least one chamber pot with Franklin's face at the bottom. This is what happens when you become really famous. The chamber pot was something that Louis XVI presented to a lady at court who seemed just a tiny bit besotted by the learned North American. But I show a fraction of the popular images by which people who would never meet Franklin would actually kind of know what he looked like. This is a segment that are simply the fur cap interpretations of Franklin produced in France during his heyday, so many that Franklin bragged to his daughter that copies upon copies of himself were spread everywhere and have made your father's face as well known as that of the moon. So enormous was Franklin's fame with its original grounding in his scientific research that it generated an enormous irony. The science is strangely absent from his memoirs. I say strangely because the science had to exist for demand for the memoirs, a demand that started in the late 1760s. And without the science, it would not have made sense for anyone to implore Franklin to write up the story of his life. And remember Franklin's quip that he wrote the story of his life to gratify his vanity. It's a nice joke, but he clearly didn't want the narrative to be filled with what looked like bragging on and on and on about why he was famous. He was confident that his contemporaries, unlike us, knew about and might even have read the autobiography's rival, the famous book, The Experiments and Observations on Electricity. It was everywhere, running through 6 ever-expanding editions in English during Franklin's lifetime, appearing in a massive multi-volume French edition and in various forms and pieces reprinted in still other European languages, German, Italian, Swedish, on and on. So, when he came to write to his memoirs, he obviously worried, why even mention the science, if that might seem to be bragging, and if it was totally obvious that everyone knew about it already? He seems to have worried about this a great deal because the experiments are barely mentioned in the memoirs, and I know this from consulting the manuscript here, while I was working on a new edition of the autobiography as a Norton Critical edition. That came out in January 2012, so I'm deducing that I saw the manuscript here no earlier than 2011. And at that point, the best published version of the manuscript was what's called a genetic edition, which reproduces a text in order to distinguish with what was in the original draft, what was added later, what was deleted, and in Franklin's case, what was in that margin. That represented longer annotations or emendations, where he cut, added, and transformed his initial thoughts about himself. Now, in this case especially, where there are modifications to the text as originally composed and then all the stuff in the margin, a genetic text cannot really represent what layers of changes were made at various different moments. It seemed to me from the genetic edition that Franklin had tried different options for where he would at least mention his electrical experiments and his science in general, but the pattern wasn't clear. So I petitioned the library authorities here for permission to consult the manuscript on these grounds, that I had a question that could not be solved by any published editions, and I'm so grateful they said yes, and I got to look at the original myself. And I immediately knew that this was, I always knew it was a special book, but the specialness of it was made especially apparent when I requested that the manuscript or version be delivered to me, and I was sitting in the reading room, noticing that suddenly every library staff person I'd seen in that day was there, waiting to see it, because unless somebody requests it, it doesn't come out of where it lives, very, very, very protected, and this was their opportunity. And that was kind of amazing to witness, just the desire people would have to see the object. And then it was delivered to me. I opened it, and what I discovered was that Franklin had considered putting the electrical experiments in 3 scattered places. He was obviously thinking about where they would do their best work and yet not stand out too much. And actually, none of these 3 scattered places really clearly made it clear exactly when he had done them. So, to consider things in the order that they happened, Franklin had begun his experiments in 1745, he wrote his first report on them in 1747, and then he published the first edition of Experiments and Observations in 1751. You would not know that from the autobiography. You have to piece that together from other of Franklin's records. Franklin's initial impulse was to introduce his work with electricity alongside some non-scientific activities in the 1750s, so actually in the next decade. So we see a marginal note in the manuscript, here bring in an account of my electrical fame. In between Franklin's roles as a frontier negotiator in 1753 and as a founder of the Pennsylvania Hospital, which was founded in 1751. So this is not actually when the experiments were done. In fact, those 1750s events occurred after they were published. And notice that Franklin has crossed out electrical fame, whether to make a more modestly phrased claim. Obviously, he thought this. Other people would have agreed with him, but maybe not put it that boldly. But maybe also he was rethinking whether he would include this material there at all. We can't tell. We can't tell. He did decisively place a description of the experiments even later in the narrative, so even later than they would have actually have occurred, after he had already discussed his greatly expanded role in the Pennsylvania government and his appointment as Deputy Postmaster General for the British colonies, which in fact resulted from his sudden leap to scientific prominence. They did not precede it. Franklin does note that his first experiments occurred in 1746, but most readers easily miss that detail amid the greater attention to all the events, the later events from the 1750s. And readers must pay very careful attention to an earlier reference to the science when Franklin mentions his honorary degrees from Yale and Harvard and the fact that they were conferred in consideration of my improvements and discoveries in the electric branch of natural philosophy. So very true, but this is unhelpfully stranded amidst text on a lot of other stuff. Now, there's another misleading aspect. In his experiments and observations, Franklin explains that he had 3 scientific collaborators when he did his electrical experiments. So this is part of, these experiments resulted from a 4-man team. These were extremely interesting individuals: a silversmith, a lawyer, and a former itinerant Baptist preacher. They aren't given much space on the stage in the experiments and observations, but Franklin very shrewdly wrote the letters to put himself in the spotlight, but at least they're there, unlike in the autobiography, which mentions only one of them, the former minister. So, the jumbled chronology, the partial information, and the very diffident attention to the experiments generally, which take up much less space than the political events, has given readers ever since the misleading sense that Franklin's expanded role in Pennsylvania and imperial affairs preceded his scientific work, when in fact the reverse was true. The experiments also have the sense of incidental and eccentric pastimes that Franklin managed to fit in and around his real work in printing and politics, maybe late at night when no one else was up and around. All of this raises the question of whether Franklin would have cleared things up had he lived to complete his memoirs, to go back through them, to regularize how he presented things chronologically, and to prepare them for publication, to make a final statement about his life. The existing draft of his memoirs, as now we read it, reads as the rags to riches story of a printer who became one of the founding figures of the United States. That's an impossible story, in fact. No other colonial artisan achieved this kind of prominence. No other American founder of Franklin's visibility had earned a living by working with his actual hands. Now, there's a near exception in the case of Paul Revere, silversmith, though Revere's contributions were more restricted in time and place. It took something extraordinary to lift a printer out of a career arc that would have ended with less notable achievements, and that something, in Franklin's case, was science. No one can tell the full truth about their life. Even if they're a saint and confess their sins, they probably can't remember all of them, or even remember all of their virtues and triumphs. But Franklin's story, his life story, is notably incomplete. It's literally unfinished because it lacks the final events of the life by decades, and a story with only a few haphazard dashes of the science is just plain wrong. So reading Franklin's autobiography is wonderful. I'm glad we have it. But it's as if Albert Einstein were now remembered mostly for the charming stories of his childhood and youth, without a clear sense of what he had done to become so famous in the first place. Can we know how Franklin might have finalized his memoirs for publication? He left at least some hints in the way his literary heir handled things. He bequeathed the manuscript to the older of his 2 grandsons, William Temple Franklin, the illegitimate son of his own illegitimate son, William Franklin, the loyalist with whom Benjamin had broken. The grandfather had very deliberately separated the son and grandson by taking Temple, as he was called, to France with him, making him into a supporter of the American cause against what his father believed. Benjamin Franklin realized his obligation to launch this young man in life. Here he is. Franklin is sitting, and his handsome grandson is the fellow leaning on his elbow, kind of looking toward him. This is the unfinished group portrait of the diplomats who negotiated an end to America's war for independence. The British diplomats refused to pose, so the painter Benjamin West abandoned the work. This is all we have. It's quite evocative in many ways, but it is one of the later portraits of Benjamin Franklin and a rare one of his grandson. The elder Franklin had tried again and again to negotiate something that would give his grandson a place in the world, whether through a marriage to a member of the minor French aristocracy or a political position, which Temple's role as his secretary during the peace negotiations was supposed to supply. In the end, however, none of this worked out. In the end, Benjamin Franklin designated Temple as his literary heir and executor, recipient of a distinct set of treasures, meaning all of his grandfather's previously unpublished writings, among which were his memoirs. Franklin's last will and testament, which was legally upheld, clearly designated Temple as the lawful possessor of the manuscripts, the life story, the letters, the personal writings, as well as signaling that this grandson was the person approved to republish any writings that had previously been made public. Principal among these were Franklin's scientific writings, the electrical experiments that had made him into the modern Prometheus. The other gems were correspondence relating to Franklin's political career in the run-up to the American Revolution and through the War for Independence. So put together, the works on science, the diplomatic correspondence, and the story of the author's life would be as definitive a package of works that could be produced, barring recovery of writings that Franklin himself noted that had been lost at various earlier points in his life. He lost an entire trunk of personal papers during the war that he'd stored with friends outside Philadelphia and Pennsylvania, so if you know any family members with unexamined attics, please keep everyone's eyes open. But that's a lot of papers that we don't have about his life. Everything else was supposed to be already published or given to Temple. But Temple Franklin was slow to get anything into print. He was, in his defense, awkwardly in transit. He moved from Philadelphia back to Europe after his grandfather's death. Meanwhile, 2 other nearly full copies of the memoirs were circulating. Franklin had asked his other grandson, Benjamin Franklin Bache, to make 2 copies of the first 3 parts of the autobiography to send to friends in England and France for their criticism and thoughts for revision. Although Temple had inherited the fullest text and the implied right to publish it, he made the strategic error of telling the French recipient of one of the 2 copies, Louis-Guillaume Leviat, of his intention to publish the memoirs along with several other of his grandfather's works. Now, before Temple could do so, a French translation, almost certainly made by Leviat, of the first part of the autobiography appeared in Paris in 1791, Mémoires de la vie privée de Benjamin Franklin. Now, at least 2 things about this edition were suspicious. First, it was published anonymously. Viard did not admit to his role, nor did the printer point him out. Second, it was called La Vie Privée, a private life. Now, if you think this sounds kind of National Enquirer-like, you're right. In the run-up to the French Revolution, many a vie privée was intended to dish the dirt on the great and the good, and if there were no dirt, it could easily be made up. This wasn't the case for Franklin, but the title still had a kind of titillating quality. You want to read this, you really want to read this. The Huntington does not possess a copy of this book, and I think I approve of that. The Vie Privée, or Private Life of Franklin, sold well, encouraging other people to translate and publish it in English. 2 of these versions appeared in London in 1793. Neither of them at this point exactly resembled Franklin's own original composition in original English. At this point, Temple made an odd effort to recover the faulty and incomplete copy of the memoirs that had been the basis of the French version, not realizing that his copy was the best and longest. So the best and longest went into the hands of this French family that had produced this pirated edition. But thereafter, Temple was diligent. He worked carefully to produce a definitive edition of his Franklin's life and works. This multi-volume set was published in London between 1816 and 1819, including the first printed version of the autobiography in its original English, which Temple polished very slightly to make his grandfather's very direct 18th century prose seem less working class. This edition's reception was somewhat subdued given all the earlier editions of The Jewel and the Crown, Franklin's life story. And Temple, for reasons best known to himself, used this incomplete copy to produce his text, not realizing that he had therefore omitted the final 7 pages that Franklin had dictated to his half-brother. But this memoirs of the life and writings of Benjamin Franklin, however compromised, however delayed, was the standard edition, much reprinted and read as Franklin's definitive memoirs or life, first called an autobiography in the 1840s. The fullest original copy of the manuscript now the Huntington manuscript, stayed with the Leviard family until the 1860s. In 1866, Leviard's grandnephews, Paul and George Discernement, sold it to John Bigelow, who was U.S. Minister to France during the American Civil War and a very important diplomatic figure. Bigelow purchased the manuscript in December 1866, shortly before he left his post. He brought the manuscript back to America and published an edition of the memoirs in 1868, the first to be based on the longest of the original 3 manuscripts, so those missing 7 pages are finally printed. The manuscript changed hands again in the late 1890s when Bigelow decided to sell it to a rare book dealer, a rare book and manuscript dealer, Dodd, Mead and Company in New York. Robert Dodd was one of the 3 major brokers who supplied the library of Elihu Dwight Church, the president of Church and Dwight Incorporated, which manufactured baking soda and other household goods. Church was, in fact, more famous as a careful and discriminating rare book dealer than as an industrialist, and he amassed a remarkable collection of rare editions and manuscripts in English from both America and Britain, working with 3 major dealers, Bernard Quaritch in London and Luther S. Livingston and Robert Dodd in New York. So it was Dodd who sold the Franklin manuscript to Church, who was rather quiet about his private acquisition. Some people would brag, he did not. Not until Church published a 7-volume catalog of his collections a few months before his death in 1908 was it again known where the Franklin manuscript was. After Church's death, the disposition of his library became the subject of speculation and rumor. A consortium of New York book dealers considered pooling their resources to buy the entire collection and then sell it piecemeal to their wealthy clients. That scheme never materialized. Instead, in 1911, Henry E. Huntington bought the entire Church library for $750,000 and moved it out here to California. Now, it is always impossible to accurately translate old money into new money. $750,000 in 1911 would be worth anywhere between $14 million to $445 million today, with the Franklin manuscript only a part within that range. So, to describe the monetary value of Franklin's manuscript autobiography at that point in time, or at this point in time, I'll simply use a very technical term: huge. And thus, a physical object made from 18th century rags, ground up and fermented old tablecloths and petticoats. These rags now constitute 21st century riches. The rich implications of the manuscript also continue to be explored with an ongoing project, or a project, I've just been told it may not be ongoing, but a project that I've heard about to create an electronic edition of the handwritten original and then print a version based on that with information about, again, how to read the different layers of changes that Franklin inserted over time. And this has yielded new insights into the composition, with all of its layers continuing to be decrypted. It's only right that the investigations continue. In fact, it all seems as if Franklin had wanted his life to be a continuing puzzle. The text of his memoirs concludes with the words, "never put into execution," without even a comma or a period. There's no punctuation at the end of that word. I've seen editions that put in an ellipsis, ... but even that is an interpretation, right? Who knows? And the outline of events Franklin intended to cover ends even less helpfully, if more tantalizingly, with etc. However you may wish to think of the autobiography, I would entreat you to spare some thought to its rightful place within Franklin's own life and within ours. Franklin's literary heir got one enormous thing right, one that most editions of the autobiography don't achieve. Temple realized the significance of science to his grandfather's sense of identity, to his personal sense of himself, but also to his legacy. Temple's publication in London of his grandfather's life and works built on the model which Franklin established during his lifetime to publish book-length works that focused on science, as with the first experiments and observations also published in London. Whether because his grandfather told him to, or else simply because he followed his example, Temple followed through. not least his printing, for the first time, several of Franklin's unpublished writings on natural science. These included a diary, a rather remarkable diary dating from 1726, which his grandfather had written during his second crossing of the Atlantic Ocean, age 20, between London and Philadelphia. These events from the diary, he specified, should be included within the autobiography. It's one of the emendations, according to directions in the notes column. The manuscript of the sea diary, however, is now lost. If Temple had not followed his grandfather's instructions to print it along with the memoirs, we'd only know of the existence of the diary, not its contents. In this piece, we see Franklin first address topics in the natural world critically and experimentally. The brief diary establishes Franklin's ambition in science 2 decades before he would make good on that claim, during the first decades when natural science was being inserted into the public culture of the global West. The radical new claim that empirical proof was essential to certain kinds of necessary truths. That 18th century confidence in science would be the foundation of subsequent work in science, the generation of knowledge that we inherit and then improve, and which thereafter improves our lives if we allow it to. Let's consider this as cultural capital, intellectual wealth. And yet it's alarming that it is now increasingly squandered. Evidence-based reasons for understanding the human place within a material world have not fared well recently. The two most obvious examples of this, out of a much longer list, are probably skepticism that vaccination protects individual and public health, and denial of the science of climate change. Now, to be sure, there was debate over inoculation and climate change in the 18th century, but in some ways, I think, as a scholar of this era, the skepticism was less than what we see today. Many people have noted Benjamin Franklin's obvious and vast vanity. It's a recurring feature of Franklin's scholarship. Some people even dismiss his memoirs' smirking acknowledgement of his vanity as yet another example of it. But frankly, I wish he'd been even more vain, eager to shove his electrical experiments right under the reader's nose, to brag about his being the modern Prometheus, to revel in his status as heir of Isaac Newton. Had he filled the story of his life with the science that made his life what it was, that would have guaranteed that entire classrooms at high schools, colleges, and universities, all the places where young people are made to read the Autobiography of Benjamin Franklin, would therefore have to read about the central place of science in modern life, our essential cultural capital, our riches, may they never turn back into rags. Thank you.
Thank you, Joyce. So we have plenty of time for questions. Our experience in this room is that if you shout your question out, you can be heard, but if there's any doubt, we shall repeat it from the podium. Are there questions? The gentleman over there.
I'd just like to point out that last week when I was seeing the 1919 exhibit in the Moon Gallery, the artifact is on display.
Yes.
I opened at the notorious ink spot page, and I was excited to see that.
Yes, thank you. I just went over and saw that today because I've been told it was there and it was open. And I don't know whether you changed the opening over the course of the exhibit or it will always be. Yeah. So stay tuned. There may be other pages that are revealed. But yes, that was a page where the grandson, Benjamin Franklin Bache, I think was blamed for doing that as his grandfather's amanuensis. Something happened that day. We don't know what.
Hi there. Go ahead.
What's the meaning of the letters he always had after his name? LLD.
His first. Oh, I'm sorry. The letters that appear after Franklin's name indicate his honorary degrees. And I'm not going to remember, I think the LLD was the one from St. Andrews University in Scotland that was his first doctorate. And I can't remember what LLD stands for. Doctor of Letters, sorry. It's a general designation. That made him Dr. Franklin. And again, he was very happy about that. The honorary degrees from Harvard and Yale had been masters. So it was the Scots who made him into Dr. Franklin.
Hi there. Go ahead.
You seem to explain the lack of our knowledge of Franklin as a scientist through him not putting the information in his memoirs. But why do you think that other Franklin scholars, of whom there have been many before you, have not brought this to the fore?
Oh, yes, the question is why Franklin scholars haven't worked more on the science?
We haven't heard about this.
That's a very good question. And I will say that identification of Franklin as a person in science has varied over time anyway. The last big upsurge was in sort of from the 1940s onward, when especially through the work of a scholar, I. Bernard Cohen, who did one of the first American editions of the Experiments and Observations, 1942 or 43, and then did a lot of other work on Franklin's science. And I think the timing explains why that happened. That the United States was entering a period when it specialized in big science, and especially in terms of development of atomic weapons in physics. And so Franklin's prowess in an earlier version of physics, and the way in which the United States had a genealogy and earlier versions of history and science were suddenly more apparent and interesting. But that kind of faded from the 1940s to the 1970s. I think what's interesting now is Franklin did a lot of work on climate and atmospheric phenomena, which is what the kite experiment was. And that seems to be a new way of identifying his work in science that increasingly is important to us now. So I would say that Franklin scholars, I mean, there's a lot to work with. I don't begrudge anyone their different interests in Franklin. But I do think that we have begun to take for granted that science is in public life, and understanding how it got inserted has not seemed so important. I would say that at this moment, when science in public life is newly debated, we might want to remember that earlier history. Thank you.
Can I ask a question from the British perspective?
Okay.
So we never read this text. This text is completely irrelevant.
Which one? The autobiography?
Your biography. It never, in high school, not in college, would you ever be expected to read this text. First time I came across references to it was in the work of Max Weber, interestingly enough, which is bizarre.
Who got it from Immanuel Kant, we assume?
So my question is, given that it's ubiquitously read now, and it leaves out what you, I think, appropriately consider to be the most important aspect of his life, why read it at all?
So the director of the Huntington Library, which possesses I'm going to elliptically answer by talking about two audiences I've spoken to about this. I spoke at the Museum of Science in Paris to a French audience who all knew that Franklin was a man of science. And the museum itself might have elicited a kind of audience, but they were like, yeah, of course. And they knew, sort of things about electricity that I was kind of surprised by. So that was an interesting audience that I don't think they necessarily read the autobiography, but the public image of Franklin as a person of science is still really quite how they receive him. And then I spoke at the National Institute of Standards and Technologies, is it NIST? They're the people who tell us what the kilo actually is. And they really had an appreciation that Franklin was a scientist, even though I don't think they're an audience that really reads the autobiography. What I find interesting about the autobiography, it is one of our best pieces of evidence that science could do this to somebody. So that even if you're not interested in that story, it's implicit within the fact that it was written at all and became so sought after that pirated copies were appearing in French before any others were. So I find it fascinating for that reason. And for the way Franklin positions himself amusingly as the nobody who becomes a somebody. So that even if you don't know why, it's a great story. Yeah. The thing I think that disappoints people about its incompletion is it doesn't really get on to I think it could be happily read by people in Great Britain, because for the entire period up to 1758, Franklin was a loyal subject of His Majesty whoever. So over the course of his life. So it does not challenge, except by what comes later. It's not an anti-British text at all. It could be safely assigned to lisping school children.
Go ahead, please.
Joyce, that was really...
Hi, Carla. Hi.
Hi, Joyce. That was a really interesting talk and very
Thank you.
elegantly done. Thank you. On Weber, I would like to just point out to both of you that Weber would love Franklin because he was industrious.
Absolutely.
And he was a great example of Protestant industry, though he was a rather lackadaisical Protestant. My question is about, it seemed to me you sort of glossed over how the manuscript ended up in the French family's hands. Can you say a little bit more about
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean that to be obscure at all. So I desperately never want to become a scholar of William Temple Franklin, the kind of hot mess of the Franklin family. I don't understand most of his decisions, but at some point he thought that this French copy that his half-brother, the copy that his half-brother had made of only the 3 parts of the story that was given to this French friend somehow was superior to the one that he had, even though he could have asked his half-brother, so which one is more complete? In which case his half-brother would have said, the one you have already. But for some reason, Temple says to this French friend, do you want to swap? And so obliging, the French friend, well, of course, I will be happy to do that. And so that's how it happens.
I think it's popular in this country because it's the story of self-made man, and in a way, and of American independence, of running away from the tyrant brother. But what's puzzling is that it seems that when he talks about the inventions and various things, he never talks about how he even becomes interested in science, particularly. It's just so not there at all.
In case people haven't heard, it is sort of puzzling that Franklin, tell me if I'm misinterpreting the question, but he doesn't really identify his intellectual interests generally.
Not quite right, but again, it becomes this American story. It gets appropriated by F. Scott Fitzgerald at the end of The Great Gatsby.
There we go. Right, so the loss here is precisely in saying that part of being a self-made American is intellectual work. I mean, that is the truth of what he did. That he could have worked very hard and saved and blah, 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 and he never would have ended up as U.S. ambassador in Paris. That was something that it would have been a very wealthy, well-connected, probably Virginian or person from Massachusetts who would have done that. Never the former candle maker's son. And that's the part of the story that he unfortunately leaves out, is the sort of thing, look, you have to read a lot and be very clever and invent scientific experiments, and then you can be famous too. So the self-made story makes it sound like, he was just really diligent, and that's misleading.
But isn't the candle maker's son sort of wiped out by the success as a printer and a public figure in Philadelphia? No?
No, again, sorry, I'll go back to, this is one, I like this image of Franklin. He's at home as the thunders and lightning rage outside, and he'd rigged up his entire house as a piece of electrical equipment. That's what you do. And so he had a wire extending from the lightning rod at the top of the house that would agitate the bell coming down from the ceiling so it would ring against the other one. So he would know, when the exact kind of electricity was apparent. So I just, for anyone who would like to do that, that's how you do it. But I want to go back to that one, okay? So Washington eventually kind of gets portrayed like this, kind of, but this is extraordinary, right? Prometheus. And again, that Franklin would have enjoyed this goes without saying, that you're the youngest son of the Boston candle maker who can barely make ends meet, you're literate, great. That's about all you get out of that Boston heritage, and then there you are. So that's what's extraordinary, and that's what the science did. The autobiography is filled with all these wonderful anecdotes about getting up at, ungodly hours to make sure your neighbors can see that you're diligently working already, but that won't lead you there. Just if anyone wants to end up as the postmodern Prometheus, it takes something pretty big to do that.
And we'll take one last question. Hi there, go ahead.
Forgive me for not knowing this, but he was self-published. This text about his science work.
No, he was very careful to avoid that.
Okay.
Oh, I'm sorry. The question was whether the experiments and observations were self-published. He had seen an example of somebody do that, and that had gone very badly. In some sense, by making sure it was published in London with the forward by the right person and with the right printer. I mean, they didn't have peer review in the same way, but this sort of meant, the experts have weighed in and said that this should be printed in London. This isn't something that you don't have to pay any attention to. So it was not self-published. In contrast, Franklin had self-printed other works, including his very first experiment was actually what helped generate the Franklin stove. It was an experiment with heat. And he does self-publish that by his own press. That does fairly well, but to take on the big boys in science and say that theory of electricity is wrong and this one only has one redeeming quality, he really had to work through the cognoscenti in London to produce a text that would circulate in the right way and have the right imprimatur. So no, it wasn't self-published. Another warning if people need practical advice. So, thank you so much.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you for your consistent support of our programs, but most of all, please join me in thanking Joyce Chaplin. Coffee and cookies are served outside if you'd like to join us.